Kia ora tātou, g'day, welcome to New Zealand and welcome to my presentation. Today we're going to spend a few minutes just looking at some research that I undertook into the lives of professional paid caregivers here in New Zealand who support people with Prader-Willi syndrome. In particular, we're going to look at the strategies that these caregivers use, the ones they've developed for themselves, to address some of the practical and ethical problems that are inherent in that kind of work. My name is John. I'm a psychologist, but I'm also a former caregiver myself. I worked in residential and day services to people with disabilities, and I particularly specialised both as a caregiver and as a psychologist in support to people with very challenging behaviour. In that role, and today I work largely in schools in that kind of role, but in that role, I've always been impressed by the unique challenges that face people who support people with Prader-Willi syndrome. And in particular, I wanted to know how best to provide those caregivers professional development and training and advice. And that was the main motivation for this study. Study was based around two research questions. The first is that lived experience kind of question that'll be familiar to lots of you if you know some qualitative research. I just want to know, what is it like to be one of these caregivers? Secondly, I wanted to know, as I've mentioned, how do caregivers address the ethical and practical problems they face? Going into this research, I thought I pretty much knew quite a lot about what I would expect to hear from caregivers. I expected to hear about this problem, this dilemma that I've called the central dilemma facing paid caregivers of people with Prader-Willi syndrome. On the one hand, almost the definitive defining characteristic of Prader-Willi syndrome is hyperphagia, as that drive to seek and consume excessive quantities of food, even at the risk of very negative outcomes. And so that means that caregivers are expected in support of people with Prader-Willi syndrome to exert some control over access to food. However, at the same time, these caregivers are employed by generic New Zealand disability services, and the promotion of service users' independence and legal rights are core values for these disability support agencies within Aotearoa New Zealand. So that presents caregivers with a dilemma that they have to find a way to solve every day. That dilemma has been given a number of names, described in a number of different ways. It's been called the duty of care versus our duty to promote independence. It's been called paternalism versus a respect for civil rights. It's been called prioritising safety or prioritising autonomy for our clients. It can be described philosophically in a number of different ways, but in practice, in the world where caregivers live, this ethical dilemma is made much more complicated by the fact that control over access to food for many people with Prader-Willi syndrome is just a very difficult job to achieve. It's made much more complicated by the determination and creativity of many people who have Prader-Willi syndrome and their search for food and their efforts at foraging. But also, many of the people we know who have the syndrome are also very articulate and determined self-advocates. And so if there is a breach of their legal or their civil rights, they're very clear and very able to say so and to seek redress. So not just an ethical dilemma, but an intensely practical one as well. I looked at this using three studies. A brief scoping study in which I interviewed groups of caregivers supporting people with Prader-Willi in workplace-based focus groups. The main outcome from this study that I learned was that caregivers have a lot to say, and it's worth listening to. In particular, caregivers who I spoke to in this study loved to tell their stories. That informed the design, particularly of study 3 later on. Secondly, I made an attempt at a nationwide population survey. I tried to find, identify and survey every single person in New Zealand who had Prader-Willi syndrome and who was over 16 years of age. I'd love to be able to talk more about the results of that survey, but sadly there just isn't time. And finally, the study that we're going to talk most about today, and that was in-depth interviews with 11 professional caregivers, a diverse range of caregivers, Māori and Pākehā, that is European New Zealanders, roughly equally divided, 10 women, 1 man, spread geographically across the North Island of New Zealand, mostly working in separate services and in different types of services. So a very diverse group of caregivers. But the other thing that we'll find as we go on and talk about results is that even though they were a diverse group in diverse circumstances, there was a high degree of agreement and consensus and commonality in the things they described in talking about their work. In particular, when I came to transcribe each of the conversations that I'd recorded, and I searched for themes within them, this very clear narrative proved central to all of the conversations we'd had. Firstly, caregivers defined their role in terms of the challenges it presented. Anytime you asked a caregiver about their job, they would talk about the problems it presented. Simple as that. A very, very strong theme. But they didn't just talk about the challenges, they talked about their responses to those challenges, the ways in which they and their colleagues had met them, and that kind of implied the third step, the goals that they were choosing to try and achieve in selecting those responses. So what kind of challenges did caregivers describe? Well, I expected mostly challenges related to access to food. In fact, the pattern that was described by caregivers was a little bit different from that. They certainly did describe managing access to food as a very significant challenge. However, several caregivers called this some version of the easiest challenge. By that, I don't think they meant that it was easy to do in practice. I think they meant that it was at least a straightforward challenge. It was a known challenge and one that they were to some extent equipped to meet. But it was only one of a broad range of challenges that caregivers identified. And in general, they described challenge as arising from multiple sources. There were lots of different challenges from lots of different directions. And they described challenges arriving on one hand as being unrelenting and chronic and facing the same challenges every day and needing to respond in an excellent kind of way consistently every day. But at the same time, they also described the challenges they faced as dynamic and constantly changing and requiring creative responses on their part. So, challenge arising from multiple sources, challenge that was at the same time chronic and unrelenting, but also dynamic and demanding creativity. This was the pattern of challenge that caregivers described. So where did that challenge come from in their work? Well, caregivers, as I expected, talked about a whole variety of foraging behaviour or food-seeking behaviour in those they support. They talked about theft of food and theft of money to buy food. They talked about bargaining, flattery, the telling of untruths, absconding, threats of violence, real violence, actual violence, outbursts of anger, and in one person's case, a profound ability to pick padlocks and open them. So, I mean, a wide range of absconding, foraging behaviour. But caregivers also described non-food related challenging behaviour as well, and also described that as intensely challenging in a number of examples, particularly behaviours of excess in other areas. Caregivers talked about craft materials, um, skin lotion or shampoo, or access to favourite activities like a chat room or a country music club, in one example, all being used to excess by people with Prader-Willi syndrome, and all requiring caregivers to exert some degree of control to prevent really negative outcomes. So behaviours of excess, not just around food, but around other things as well. Caregivers also described interpersonal conflicts and the risk of those interpersonal conflicts, either between the person with Prader-Willi syndrome and fellow residents, or between them and caregivers, as another common source of challenge in their work. Either those conflicts themselves or the sort of constant risk of those conflicts and that need to be managed. And it was interesting because there were some features that were unusual about those conflicts. One was that they seemed to be particularly intense and to have a particularly negative emotional impact on many of those who experienced them. They were described in that way. Secondly, they seemed to feature, or a common feature of stories about these kinds of conflicts was inflexibility on the part of a person with Prader-Willi syndrome. It's like as if the person with Prader-Willi syndrome had taken up a position at the time that the argument, the conflict had begun, and they were absolutely unable almost to divert from that position, unable to compromise. And finally, caregivers often seem to describe an unusual, even experienced caregivers described an unusual degree of surprise at how intense these conflicts were. And I called this aspect of surprise relationship dissonance. It was like caregivers were taken off guard. As I say, even experienced caregivers describe themselves as being taken off guard when they expected the person with Prader-Willi syndrome to behave in one way, and then suddenly they behaved in an entirely different way, usually in a more challenging kind of way. That degree of surprise, of unpredictability in the behavior with the person with Prader-Willi syndrome often seemed to add an extra level, an extra layer of emotional distress for caregivers and for others around the person with Prader-Willi. It seemed basically to make the interpersonal conflict more difficult to deal with for caregivers. Other sources of challenge often came from the community around which or in which caregivers worked, and sometimes from the organisation that employed them as well. We could talk about this for a very long time, and we had some very interesting conversations with caregivers, but fundamentally, caregivers often describe themselves as having lots and lots of responsibility, of being intensely aware of the potential risks if they made a mistake in their work, and at least two caregivers described the premature or the sudden death of a client with Prader-Willi syndrome as a result of a single incident of hyperphagia. So caregivers were intensely aware of the responsibility that they carried, and of course that was a source of challenge for them. But they also describe themselves as vulnerable to criticism from multiple parties, often from people who were unaware of the particular needs of people with Prader-Willi syndrome. And that led them to a very common sense of isolation. These caregivers describe themselves as isolated even within the New Zealand disability community. Having said that, there was also a very strong counter-narrative. It's absolutely true. Every single interview featured lots of smiles, lots of stories, and almost all featured lots of laughter. Multiple incidents of funny stories and shared laughter. And several caregivers said in as many words, "It's a great job and I love it." The reasons why they loved it were also diverse, but some common themes here were that they genuinely appreciated and enjoyed the company and the relationship that they'd formed with the person with Prader-Willi who they supported. They fundamentally liked them and enjoyed their success. It's also seemed that caregivers appreciated and found value in supporting these people well. It's perhaps not too big a stretch to say, for some caregivers at least, it was a great job because it was challenging, and that challenging seemed meaningful and important. So, important not to lose this point as we go through the rest of a discussion of this research. When caregivers talked about how they responded to this raft of challenges, one thing was very clear. My central dilemma, autonomy versus paternalism, had already been pretty clearly resolved. Caregivers all prioritised client safety ahead of all other concerns in almost every situation they described, and in order to do that, they made shamelessly authoritarian decisions, and I've called them substitute decisions here, that certainly limited the civil rights of a person with Prader-Willi syndrome in order to protect that safety. Often, caregivers described forming a kind of, or what I've termed a benevolent conspiracy with family members, with other caregivers, with neighbours or shopkeepers, in order to limit the person with Prader-Willi syndrome's choices in order to achieve larger goals of safety. It was also interesting, though, to notice that caregivers described strongly valuing physical safety and well-being, not just for their clients who had Prader-Willi syndrome, but for the entire group of people they supported. And in fact, in many of the conversations, excuse me, it was clear that sometimes compromises were made in the safety of a person with Prader-Willi syndrome in order to achieve broader goals for the whole group. It seemed very clear, we'll talk about this a little more later on, that caregivers saw themselves as supporting a group, the group of people for whom they were responsible, rather than as supporting a number of individuals. So the protection of clients' physical safety was the primary goal that trumped all others among the caregivers who participated in this study. However, they also described secondary goals, told many stories about finding ways within that safety plan to promote choice, a sense of fairness, and a sense of autonomy among the people with Prader-Willi syndrome they supported. Sometimes this was in small ways, like people being encouraged to choose the particular leafy green that went into their salad with their calorie-managed dinner. But often too, actually they were quite significant risks that were taken in the promotion of this supposedly safe autonomy. So, for example, a man was described being supported to get his driver's license and to own and maintain and drive his own car. Other people were described being supported by caregivers to make quite complex plans to allow them to attend family events or social groups in safe ways, even though they knew food would be present there. This was an interesting finding because it seemed on reflection to represent a kind of contradiction. On the one hand, safety is paramount. On the other hand, why take these risks at all? Why seek to give people with Prader-Willi syndrome that sense of autonomy or that sense of fairness if it meant some degree of increased risk? Well, caregivers certainly described not just pursuing physical safety, but they described that in the context of a broader goal, which we might call emotional and physical well-being, if you like. So they saw that in bigger terms. But I think it's also significant that the caregivers I spoke to also, as a group, seem to regard some degree of risk as inevitable. Regardless of their safety plan, regardless of what they put in place, there was some sense that their life in the community was so complex, and also the people they supported were often so creative that really it was impossible to completely eliminate risk entirely. As a result, their focus seemed much more on the management of and the mitigation of risk rather than on its elimination. So that meant that goals like empathy towards the person with Prader-Willi syndrome, or that sense of fairness, or the importance of managing service users' anxiety, those things that might seem like secondary goals, actually could be important tools at managing and further lowering that risk, even though it couldn't be reduced entirely. So, for example, many caregivers expressed the view, and particularly in stories they told, that managing the anxiety that people with Prader-Willi syndrome experienced was an important way of helping them to maintain an even emotional keel, and so reduce the risk both of overeating and of conflict within the household, which also generated negative outcomes for people. It's also interesting to note that caregivers were very clear on the subject of consistency between them and their colleagues. Consistency among caregivers was regarded as an essential feature of an effective service. So, caregiver goals. In short, we could say that safety remains paramount, although space remains for other priorities. Perhaps more accurately, though, with a little more detail, we could reflect on the work of a group from the Netherlands, from Maastricht University, led by Van Horen, who conducted a similar study. Van Horen et al. Identified and interviewed a large group of family and paid caregivers of people with Prader-Willi syndrome, mostly adults or young adults. And they noted a similar pattern, that physical safety was a primary concern for the caregivers that they interviewed, but also that was expressed in the context, a broader context of emotional well-being. So physical safety, but not just physical safety. Van Horen et al. Also noted this interesting feature that even though services to people with Prader-Willi syndrome in the Netherlands were organised around the needs of individuals, they're individually assessed, individual plans, individual funding packages in many cases, for the caregivers, they were looking for outcomes that yielded benefits for the group, not just for the person with Prader-Willi syndrome alone. And this was exactly the same as we found in our study of New Zealand caregivers. Even when making decisions around a food management regime for an individual who had Prader-Willi syndrome, the needs of all of the residents in that house, all of the people for whom that caregiver had some responsibility, were taken into account. It seemed that for caregivers, their job was not to care for a group of individuals, but was very much a corporate task. So, even when they love their work, and they often do, caregivers seem to define it in terms of the challenges that it presents to them and the ways in which they have to find to respond to those challenges. The challenges they identify arise from multiple sources. They're not just to do with access to food, but that central theme of the behaviour of service users with Prader-Willi syndrome accounted for a large part of those challenges. That central dilemma, safety versus autonomy, has been resolved firmly in favour of safety. So although the physical safety of residents is the paramount goal of caregivers, at the same time, the caregivers interviewed for this study seemed to believe that some degree of risk at least was inevitable. That entirely eliminating risk and ensuring personal safety was an impossible goal. And that meant that risks had to be managed and tolerated, at least to some extent, because they couldn't be entirely eliminated. Caregivers also seemed to tell a lot of stories, especially when they were asked to describe the solutions to complex problems and how they arrived at them. Sometimes they even told stories about using stories within their team of caregivers to solve problems. So the power of caregivers' work stories could perhaps also be one of the useful conclusions to take away from this study. And finally, caregivers often seem to support the group rather than just individuals. The sort of indivisible quantum unit of their work seemed to be the group rather than just the person with Prader-Willi syndrome. Well, thank you so much. That's my presentation. If it's raised any issues that you would like to discuss further, please do contact me. But I think also we have some time for some questions.